You know, there are three things you just don't mess with in this world: Texas property law, a hungry bear, and the natural flow of water. And today, I'm going to tell you how I, a simple freelance hydraulic engineer, used the wisdom of a 19th century genius to flood the mansions of my entire HOA board, simply because they thought concrete could beat nature. Hey, everyone, my name is Sam Miller, and for over a decade, water has been my passion. Growing up near the big rivers, you learn to respect its power, and I chose this quiet corner of Oak Haven Estate specifically because of the beautiful, crystalline creek that ran behind my property. It wasn't just some drainage ditch. This waterway had been flowing through these lands for over 200 years, long before any of us decided to build our homes here, nourishing the old oak trees, providing a home for fish and frogs. I'd have my coffee out on the back porch every morning, just watching the light dance on the water, listening to the birds, feeling that sense of peace that only a wild, flowing creek can give you. That peaceful routine came to a screeching, concrete pouring halt at 6 a.m. on a Tuesday morning. I rushed outside and found Brenda Rhodes, our HOA president, standing there with her clipboard and that smug, perfected smile that looked like she hadn't genuinely laughed in 20 years. She was wearing one of her signature platinum blonde hairstyles and a terrifyingly expensive designer pantsuit, perfectly coiffed despite the early hour. And behind her, a construction crew was actively dumping thick, gray sludge directly into my beloved creek. "What the hell is going on here?" I shouted over the noise of the machinery. Brenda turned to me with that condescending look she'd mastered. "Oh, Miller, we're improving this area, building a premium tennis court with a children's playground. This project will increase property values by 30%, she announced, as if destroying a 2-century-old ecosystem was a necessary luxury upgrade. "But this is a natural creek. You can't just," I started, but she cut me off with a wave of her manicured hand. "I can and I will." The HOA voted 12-3. "You lost. The thing is, I remembered that meeting." Brenda had called it on short notice, a Tuesday afternoon when most working residents couldn't attend. She'd presented a vague proposal about community beautification and showed glossy renderings of families picnicking beside a pristine stream, not a tennis court built over a concrete-filled grave. She never said a word about filling in the actual creek. The vote was rushed, the discussion stifled, and as I stood there watching the concrete pour, turning the clear water into an industrial wasteland, my heart just sank. My neighbor, Old Man Henry, shuffled over, still in his bathrobe. Henry was a retired lawyer in his 70s whose family had owned land in this area since the 1800s. "Sam, they can't do this," he said, his voice shaking with anger. "This creek has been here for 2 centuries. My grandfather used to fish for trout here before the subdivision was built. This is criminal." "Don't worry, Henry." I clenched my fists, feeling the rage building inside me. "I'll handle this." As the workers continued, I noticed something that flipped the switch from personal offense to professional outrage. They weren't following any standard environmental protocols. No silt fences, no containment measures. This wasn't just aesthetically tragic, it was legally and environmentally criminal. That evening, I went through all the HOA documents I could find. Buried deep in the financial reports was the evidence. Brenda Rhodes held significant shares in Granite Falls Development, the very company chosen for this concrete job. The conflict of interest was as clear as the water that used to flow in that creek. I also found the original meeting minutes had been doctored. The vote was much closer than Brenda claimed, and the required environmental impact assessment? Nowhere to be found. State law clearly mandates permits from the Department of Environmental Protection for affecting a natural waterway. I spent the next morning at the county courthouse, diving into property records. The clerk at the records office, an older gentleman named Walter, recognized me. "Looking for something specific, Mr. Miller?" he asked. "Information about the Oak Haven Creek?" I explained the situation, and Walter's eyebrows shot up. "They're filling it in? That's not right at all." He disappeared into the archives and returned with a stack of weathered folders. "These might help," he said with a knowing smile. That's when I hit gold. An old geological survey from the 1930s detailed the area's natural water systems. The creek wasn't just random. It was the crucial release valve for the natural drainage system, regulating rainfall for the entire region. The historical documents warned that blocking this creek could lead to catastrophic flooding in the lower residential areas. What truly caught my eye was a reference to the Fairweather drainage system, an elaborate network of channels designed in the 1880s to manage water flow during heavy rainfall. The system had been partially filled in during the mid-20th century development boom, but the core structure remained beneath the surface. I realized what Brenda had done. She had effectively put a cork in an underground reservoir that was still being filled. It was only a matter of time before the pressure built up and found another way out. Water always wins in the end, Walter told me as I gathered the copies of the relevant documents. I think someone's about to learn that lesson the hard way. I spent the next few days conducting my own survey. Using ground-penetrating radar equipment borrowed from a university colleague, I located the dormant remnants of the old Fairweather channels. The entire estate was built on what hydrologists call a perched water table. Blocking the creek had created an imminent flood risk for the entire community. I prepared a formal report detailing my findings, complete with historical references and flooding projections. I filed an emergency injunction request with the county court to halt the concrete pouring. The next day, I called Jim Carter, the contractor Brenda had hired. Jim and I had crossed paths before. He was a decent guy. "Jim, you know this is illegal, right?" I heard him sigh heavily on the other end. "I know, Sam, but Brenda, she threatened to expose some tax issues I'm dealing with if I don't cooperate. I've got kids to feed, man. My daughter's starting college. I can't afford to lose this job." "I understand," I said, genuinely feeling for him. "Just do me a favor. Tell me where they plan to pour concrete next." "They're planning to extend the fill another 50 yards upstream tomorrow," he whispered. "Brenda wants to divert what's left of the creek into underground pipes. If that happens, the whole ecosystem is destroyed." The court was reviewing my injunction, but bureaucracy moves slowly. I needed to act. That evening, I got a call from an unfamiliar number. It was Inspector Monroe from the County Environmental Protection Division. "Mr. Miller," he said in a serious tone, "we've received your report, and we're taking it very seriously. However, these investigations take time. Hypothetically speaking," he paused, the message crystal clear, "restoring historical water management systems is protected under state law. If someone were to clear debris from an existing, documented historical drainage system on public land, that would be perfectly legal. Just something to consider." I had allies in the system, but they needed time. Then, I had an unexpected visitor. Maria Chavez, one of the HOA board members, showed up at my door looking nervous, glancing over her shoulder. Maria, a marketing executive, had always seemed reasonable. "Sam, I need to talk to you," she whispered. "Brenda," she manipulated the results. "She's been meeting with board members privately, promising them a cut of the profits. Do you have proof?" She pulled out her phone. "I've been recording the private meetings. Listen to this." Brenda's voice came through clearly. "Vote for this project, and I guarantee your property value will increase by at least 20%. Plus, there might be some additional benefits for those who support me." Maria played several more recordings, each more damning. In one, Brenda explicitly discussed receiving kickbacks from Granite Falls. In another, she threatened a board member with zoning violations if they didn't comply. "She's got dirt on half the board members," Maria continued, shaking her head in disgust. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because what she's doing is wrong. And because my brother is a marine biologist. When I told him about the creek, he nearly had a heart attack. This creek is home to several species of rare freshwater mussels. What Brenda is doing could have serious ecological consequences." Maria provided me with all her recordings and agreed to testify. She also confirmed Brenda's ultimate plan. The tennis court was just phase one. She was planning a complete luxury recreation complex that would bury the entire creek system under concrete. It was a hydrologic disaster waiting to happen. I looked at Henry, who had stopped by. "I'm not going to dig any illegal channels," I told him. "I'm going to restore the old Fairweather channels that were filled in a century ago." Henry's eyes lit up. "The Fairweather channels. My father used to tell stories about how those channels saved this area during the Great Flood of '54. Samuel Fairweather was a genius ahead of his time." Henry went to his car and returned with a dusty leather folder. "These belong to my father. He fought to have the system preserved beneath the surface when they developed this subdivision. He knew a time might come when we'd need it again." The folder contained the complete, detailed plans for the Fairweather system. That night, I was poring over the maps. I discovered the genius of Samuel Fairweather. He designed the system to work with gravity and natural topography. The channels would only activate when the water pressure in the creek reached a certain level. And this was the best part. Fairweather's notes said he wanted any flooding to affect the lowest-lying areas of the estate first, so the manor lords would be motivated to maintain the system properly. Even a 19th-century engineer knew that the best way to ensure proper water management was to make sure the rich folks got wet feet first. The next few days were a blur. I acted normal during the day, but at night, I became an amateur archaeologist, carefully excavating the old waterways on public land, following the historical maps and the explicit instructions from the archives. I made sure to document everything, photos, notes, to prove I wasn't creating new waterways, but simply restoring historical ones. I was careful to follow the original design, ensuring the channels would only activate under critical pressure levels. I wasn't creating flooding. I was simply allowing the excess water to follow its natural path once Brenda's concrete blockage forced it to find an alternative route. Brenda started getting suspicious. She confronted me one morning while I was supposedly planting new flower beds. "Miller, I've noticed you digging around lately," she said, her heels sinking into my freshly turned soil. "Oh, that," I replied casually, leaning on my shovel. "I'm participating in a local archaeology project, studying the area's ancient irrigation systems. Did you know this land was once home to a sophisticated water management network?" I showed her a perfectly legitimate historical research permit I had obtained through Professor Jenkins, the hydrologist historian I met at the archives. "Just make sure you're not doing anything that affects HOA property," she warned, clearly not buying my explanation, but unable to prove otherwise. Meanwhile, Maria kept feeding me valuable information. "Brenda is planning a huge barbecue party this weekend," she told me during one of our secret coffee shop meetings. "She wants to celebrate the completion of Phase 1. She's invited local politicians and potential investors. The invitation was elaborate, announcing the future of Oak Haven Estates. And get this," Maria added, leaning closer. "She plans to use HOA funds as startup capital for her private development corporation. She's using our money to fund her private business venture." I checked the weather forecast on my phone. A large storm system was moving in from the west, promising several inches of rain over the weekend. "Perfect," I said, showing Maria the radar. "Looks like we're due for some heavy rain. What are you planning, Sam?" "Me? Nothing. I'm just restoring some historical channels. What happens naturally after that is, well, natural." I showed her the Fairweather plans. "This isn't sabotage, Maria. It's 18th century engineering doing exactly what it was designed to do. Protect the community by directing excess water away from populated areas when the primary channel is blocked." By Friday night, I had successfully cleared the ancient channel system. The timing couldn't have been better. Saturday arrived with dark clouds gathering, the air thick with humidity. Despite the threatening weather, Brenda was determined to show off. The party was elaborate, catered food, a live band, and a huge banner reading, celebrating Oak Haven's future. Local politicians showed up, along with several investors interested in Brenda's development plans. She gave a speech, standing on a makeshift stage with the newly poured concrete visible behind her. "This is just the beginning of a new era for Oak Haven Estates," she announced to the crowd. "We're transforming and used, problematic land into valuable community assets. Property values are already rising, and with Phase 2, she was cut off by the first crack of thunder. The rain started as a drizzle, but quickly intensified. Brenda, determined not to let weather ruin her moment, moved the party under several large tents. The band continued playing, and Brenda continued her sales pitch. But what happened next was something even I hadn't fully anticipated. The blocked creek, faced with nowhere to go, began backing up rapidly. The concrete prevented the water from flowing through its natural channel, causing pressure to build up behind the blockage. Within an hour, the water found the path of least resistance, through the restored ancient channels. And Fairweather's century-old engineering proved its worth. The water flowed exactly where he had designed it to go, right into the low-lying areas where 6 mansions stood, all belonging to the board members who had voted in favor of Brenda's project. The first sign of trouble came when someone noticed water bubbling up through the lawn, about 50 yards from the party tent. At first, it was just small fountains of water pushing through the grass. Then, as the rain continued, these fountains grew larger and more numerous. What the hell is happening? Brenda screamed as her expensive, professionally landscaped lawn began to bubble and foam like a witch's cauldron. Within minutes, water was seeping up from underground, turning her perfectly manicured garden into a muddy swamp. The expensive outdoor furniture began to sink into the muck, and guests were scrambling to higher ground. David Foster, the HOA treasurer, frantically tried to save his financial documents from the rising water. "My property." Brenda said there were no risks, he shouted over the sound of the rain. One by one, the other board members who had supported Brenda reported flooding. Sarah Williams' wine cellar was flooding. That's $100,000 worth of vintage wine. Richard Thompson's in-ground pool was overflowing, not with rain from above, but with groundwater pushing up from below, turning his pool area into a bizarre, upside-down fountain. The investors and politicians who had come to hear about Brenda's grand development plans were now witnessing a disaster in real time. They stood huddled under the party tent, watching as nature reclaimed what had been taken from her. Some were taking photos and videos, no doubt already composing social media posts about the debacle. I stood on my perfectly dry porch, watching the chaos unfold. My property, like those of the other residents who had opposed the project, was situated on slightly higher ground, exactly as the Fairweather system had been designed to protect. Old Man Henry joined me, bringing over some coffee and his old binoculars for a better view. "Look at our president," he chuckled, pointing to where Brenda was trying to wade through her flooded yard, her $1,000 heels ruined by muddy water. "You know what the best part is?" Henry said, sipping his coffee. "This is exactly what the old Fairweather channels were designed to do. Protect the higher ground where the regular folks lived, while flooding the estates of anyone who messed with the natural water flow." Fairweather was a man of the people. Jim Carter, the contractor, quietly approached my porch. He looked relieved despite the chaos. "How did you know this would happen?" he asked in amazement. "I'm a hydraulic engineer," I replied with a shrug. "And I read local history. Our ancestors weren't stupid. They understood water management better than we give them credit for." Fairweather studied this land for years before designing his system. He knew exactly where the water wanted to go naturally, and instead of fighting it, he worked with it. "Well," I replied, watching as Brenda's expensive party continued to dissolve into chaos. "It looks like Mother Nature just offered her opinion on cutting corners with water management." By evening, with the party in ruins and several estates flooded, Brenda was on the phone with the police, accusing me of sabotage. "He did something. I know he did. This is deliberate. This is terrorism." The next morning, Inspector Monroe arrived to investigate. He spent several hours examining the area, paying particular attention to the restored Fairweather channels, comparing them to the historical plans I had provided. After his investigation, Monroe called a meeting. "I've determined that Mr. Miller has only reopened an ancient drainage system on public land," Monroe began, looking directly at Brenda. "These channels are documented in county records as historical artifacts. There's nothing illegal here. In fact, the flooding appears to be a natural consequence of blocking the creek. If anything, filling the creek might be the illegal action here." Brenda's face turned purple with rage. "But my house is flooded. He must have done something." "Ma'am," Monroe said patiently, "your house isn't a natural flood zone. The only reason it wasn't flooding before was because the creek was doing its job. By filling it in, you created this situation. Mr. Miller simply restored a historical drainage system that's over 140 years old. According to the State Historical Preservation Act, that's not only legal, but encouraged." Then, Maria Chavez decided it was time to speak up. She stood up, pulling out her phone. "I have something everyone needs to hear," she announced, her voice steady. She played recording after recording of Brenda making corrupt deals, threatening board members, and discussing kickbacks with contractors. The room fell into stunned silence. "I was deceived," David Foster shouted, his face red with anger. "She told me property values would skyrocket. She never mentioned flooding risks." One by one, the truth came out, revealing a pattern of corruption and manipulation. Jim Carter, now under police protection, decided to come clean about everything. "Rhodes forced me to falsify the environmental reports," he testified. "She knew filling the creek was illegal from the start. When I hesitated, She threatened to ruin my business. The inspector's investigation revealed even more. Brenda had received $200,000 in kickbacks from Granite Falls Development. She had also been siphoning HOA funds into a private account for personal expenses. At an emergency HOA meeting that evening, the vote was conducted openly and transparently. The result was 13-2. Brenda Rhodes was removed from her position. The legal consequences for Brenda were severe. She faced multiple charges: corruption, fraud, environmental violations, and forgery. She was fined $500,000 and sentenced to 2 years of probation with 600 hours of community service, specifically environmental cleanup work. "This is a conspiracy," she screamed as the authorities led her away. "You're all backwards-thinking idiots who don't understand progress. Develop your own pockets, more like," David Foster remarked sarcastically. "The only thing you developed was a criminal record." I was elected as the new HOA president with an overwhelming majority. My first order of business was to restore the creek to its natural state. 6 months later, Oak Haven Estates had transformed into a model of sustainable development. The creek flowed freely again. Property values had increased by 40%, but this increase came from genuine improvements to the community, not from corrupt schemes. The restored creek now flowed freely, and the ancient Fairweather channels were preserved as historical landmarks. The ultimate irony came when Brenda's community service was assigned. She had to work at the environmental education center that used to be her home, leading tours and explaining to visitors how greed and environmental destruction led to her downfall. I stood by the babbling creek, watching the water flow naturally once again. Dragonflies danced above the surface, and small fish darted between the rocks. "Nature is always smarter than we think," I mused. "We just need to learn to listen." My father would be proud. He always said the Fairweather channels would save this community someday. He just never imagined it would be from one of our own. Sometimes, the best revenge isn't elaborate or vindictive. It's simply allowing nature and good, honest engineering to take its course. We won that fight not with a legal trick, but with the wisdom of a man from the 1880s who understood that you have to work with water, not against it. But it makes you wonder, how often do these self-serving HOA presidents get away with it? How often are critical environmental protections being ignored for the sake of a tennis court and a quick stock profit? Have you ever had to fight a seemingly insurmountable local power for a principle? Was it worth the effort? Tell me your thoughts. Let me know where you're watching from. And if you think Brenda Rhodes' sentence was fair, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories of justice flowing where it needs to go.